About a year ago, I filmed a video with the Wine Education Council that was supposed to be about this subject. And then for whatever reason, probably because it's a little controversial, they decided not to publish it. So I had a bunch of research, and then over the last year, like whenever I see a headline, I stash it into this one document. So I have like this shitload of information about it. It's just not, because it's been a year since I did that project, like it's not all completely like memorizable, but like what I did, I think it might be interesting when you bring up this is why I'm trying to figure out where to tie these in. So I think you mentioned the ICCPUD in the first point there. At some point, what I would like to do, and maybe I could, sorry to talk all this through, but maybe let me look at question number one. I mean, if you take the first part of that question, what do you make of the rise in anti-alcohol messaging, particularly from public health organizations? Mm-hmm. I'd like to kind of go off a little bit on that and actually, like, just for the audience, bring them up to speed on like what the ICCPUD is and who's on that committee versus what the NASM panel is and who is on that. Just because I think that's an important piece of kind of reference to frame. So at some point in time,
I think that's great. I mean, well, let's just start. Like, I don't need, like, we've already started basically. Like, and I think part of starting and talking about this is realizing that even for us, that we're really, I feel like sensitive to the messaging about anti-alcohol, which is what today's podcast is about. I don't know. Do we want to call it the anti-alcohol movement or I love, Brandon, the Neo-Prohibitionism movement, whatever it might be. It's like, what is the wine industry's response to that? And I'm not really interested in the wine industry. We learn, as we learn in the MW program, there is no such thing as the wine industry. We are a group of people and a group of organizations, and we don't always agree on anything. But the three of us are as a point of introduction, I don't want to call it a tasting group. It's a dinner party phenomenon. I don't know what it is. Yeah. We call it VGS, so it's the Very Good Shit Tasting Group, and it's winemakers and some other prominent people in the wine business in our I guess region that come together, and we try to have dinner once a month. And what we end up talking about, when we first started this, it was like we would all sit down and we would commune, but then eventually it makes its way around to, hey, what are you doing in the winery? And then Tyler might talk about, I want to talk to you about on another podcast, Tyler, is all your tannin trials and all your like nerdy stuff. Brandon, you have equally as nerdy stuff. I consider myself a pretty big nerd, but I'm the less of the nerds here with the nerds. I'm not as well versed on this as you are, Brandon. There was a federal report from either the ICCPUD that was, I think, released through Health and Human Services, and you can sort of talk about that concluded that even very low levels of alcohol, and this is as little as 1 drink per day, increase the risk of death from cancer or liver disease. It says injuries, which I assume to mean, I don't know, someone stepping off a curb and falling into a car or anyway, other causes. But the point being is that no net benefit to alcohol consumption was found, even at moderate levels, which kind of contradicted the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that had previously found this potential like mortality benefit, right? If you were drinking at moderate levels, and moderate levels, I think it's 7 drinks per week for women, double that for men, even though now I think it's maybe back down to just 7 for both men and women. So after this study came out, the U.S. Surgeon General advised or urged, cancer warnings to go on all alcohol containers the way they are with cigarettes.
Can I just interrupt? It's the former Surgeon General, right?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I should say. No, just making sure we have the timeline. Just the timeline.
Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General. So yes, he issued an official advisory that kind of reaffirmed this link between alcohol and, 7 different cancers. And so this led to the New York Times articles, which then I started seeing people talk about it in the tasting rooms after this, right? It kind of became a subject of conversation. Like, her name is it Ronnie Rabin? Is that the correct pronunciation? Or Roni Robin? I don't know how to pronounce her name exactly. So I guess my first question to you guys, and we'll dive into this really specifically, I think, about what the actual risks are, but what do you make of this, like this kind of the rise in anti-alcohol messaging? I mean, these are major public health organizations that are telling us to stop drinking entirely.
Mm-hmm.
I'm laying that in your lap now.
Okay, I'm going to let Brandon go first, but for the audience, I just want to make sure there's full disclosure that we're recording this around lunchtime, and I am having a glass of red wine.
Oh my God, I didn't introduce you. Brandon Sparks-Gillis of Dragonet Cellars and Tyler Thomas of Starlane and Deerberg, two of my very dearest friends in the world. So, okay, Brandon, have at it.
Well, while we're on legal disclosure, we should say that we are speaking as individuals and we are not representing our wineries. As this is actually one of the things that's a bit striking about this is that there's been a viral explosion of anti-alcohol and sort of pseudoscience regarding alcohol and health. I mean, as you said, from really things that people at one point in time might have concluded to have a lot of authority. For instance, the World Health Organization, they actually came out a couple of years before this claiming that, quote, risk starts from the first drop. So again, it's a radical shift in messaging from the French paradox that we grew up on, that famous 60 Minutes episode that talked about the benefits of red wine. So just to give a little bit of context, wineries actually are prohibited by law from making health claims. So again, we are speaking as individuals, not as wineries, though we participate in wineries. But I think one thing that I'll start with is
so good, Brandon.
Well, hey,
nice.
just doing the legalese here. But
yeah,
one thing
I
think that we should do as a framework is to sort of look behind the scenes and sort of say, where did these recommendations come from? Yeah. And Amy, you briefly mentioned the ICCPUD, which is a group that was put together, and they were actually established to take a look at the upcoming USDA dietary guidelines to see whether there's going to be changes in the levels of recommended consumption. And the important thing to point here is that the ICCPUD, it sounds like a very important scientific panel, but there's no medical doctors on that committee. So, I mean, I'd like to actually just quickly run down who's on that committee.
Yeah, and would you give us what the ICCPUD, what it stands for? I mean, I've got it right here, but I just didn't know if you knew it.
Interagency Coordinating Committee on the Prevention of Underage Drinking.
Yeah, I didn't know this existed.
Well, that's because it's a recent creation. And by the way, I mean, this is something that right there shows a bias because it's directed at underage drinking, which I don't think that anybody would object to the idea of trying to regulate alcohol. I mean, it's 21 and over in the United States, therefore underage drinking is something that should be prevented and regulated.
Right.
So that shows a little hint of bias, and then that bias actually increases when you sort of look at the makeup of the committee. So again, it's wide-ranging. There's Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of the Department of Defense. There's somebody from the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services. But when you start to get into the quote-unquote doctors in the room or people who would be viewed as scientists, they're coming rather than from the medical world, from the world of social science and mental health. So there's actually the Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Abuse, the director of NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So obviously nobody wants drunk drivers. The active secretary for the Administration of Children and Families is in the Department of Health and Human Services. So what's important to initially note on this is something that's giving health advice, and there's not a single doctor on the panel. Yeah. So that alone should raise some red flags as to how the public views this. But unfortunately, that's never disclosed. And so when you look at outlets in the mainstream media that are actually the arbiters of taste and quote unquote fact, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, I mean, this is picked up virally among a number of people, but nobody seems to mention that these aren't doctors making these claims. So I think that first and foremost is really important to take into consideration when you're looking at
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so as a result of that, there's more than 110 members of Congress that have called for the government to shut this particular study down. Because this came about, again, to give it a little bit of a framing, when the reviews are done for the dietary guidelines, these are multi-year reviews where there are specific panels that meet to do discussions. So for instance, we might remember the food pyramid from where we were kids. Yeah. Things like that. And so alcohol is part of those recommendations. And so historically in the past, we've had committees made up of medical doctors. And in the case of the USDA guidelines, you had referenced the NASEM panel earlier. That acronym, I'm forgetting, the National Academy of Science.
National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine.
Yes, and so that's actually the group that is typically tasked with coming up with the guidelines. So bringing in the social scientist was something that happened very, very recently. And again, shows bias, because if you're looking at the social science perspective, they're going to be looking at things like the absolute, bottom of the barrel of the worst of what happens in alcohol consumption. So when you're looking at addiction, there is just over 7% of the population who has a genetic predilection to alcoholism. And I think we would all unilaterally agree that it's really important within, whether it's the wine world or our greater culture in general, to acknowledge that and to treat that category separately, where I would argue that I would absolutely vote for there to be more and more resources in order to assist people who do have a problem with alcohol. But again, for the 92+% at this point in time, that the 92% healthy cohort is now being attacked with really misleading evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really good. And one of the things that I want to say, it's like when I was reading this, and when it said that increased the risk of death from cancer and liver disease. So you guys, I went 2 years ago and I did one of those like elective MRIs because I got scared. I was like, what about my fucking liver? Like, I'm worried about my liver, right? My liver was totally fine. It's the number one thing I put. They were like, what do you want me to look at? And I was like, look at my liver. And I literally put, I own a winery. I look at my liver. And then there was nothing wrong with it. And that was good. But this is where, when we start to look at the way that the increases in mortality are framed, it will be framed as liver disease increases 30 to 50% with moderate consumption, but there is only around a 0.2% overall population lifetime risk, which would raise the mortality risk to 0.3% or 0.4%. And even for extremely heavy drinkers, I mean, we're talking about people who are having like a fifth of Jack Daniels a day. We're only at 2 to 5%. I mean, I'm not advocating for anyone to drink more, but I am saying that I'm now no longer afraid of dying of liver disease the way that I feel like the fear mongering has made me. And the same thing for pancreatic cancer. That's the other thing I wanted them to look at, because I have I've known a few people in my life to have pancreatic cancer, and you go hard and fast.
Yeah.
But the risk of pancreatic cancer is, I mean, I wrote it down here somewhere. It's if you drink 2 to 3 drinks a day, you have a 17% higher risk of developing pancreatic cancer compared to non-drinkers. But your lifetime risk at that increase is still about 2%. So it's like extremely low. And I want to talk about breast cancer when we get there, but it's sort of the same. It's like 70% increase. And it's like, but it's such a small number to begin with.
Right. I'm so glad you bring that up, Amy, because I mean, one thing I'd like to show here, so I have a little list of clippings from some headlines, because again, this topic has literally gone viral, not just in social media circles, but again, among media like the New York Times, National Geographic, media houses that historically people have relied to for real accurate information about their health. And I mean, I'm not surprised you did that. So listen to this headline from National Geographic. These are all within the last 2 years. Quote, alcohol is killing more women than ever before. That's the headline. Mm-hmm. So then again, and you think of the statistic that you just talked about, more women than ever before, if it's going from killing 0.0001 to 0.00011, that's an increase. But do we need to be alarmed? I mean, and they've really leaned into this. So I'll continue with National Geographic. Quote, when you go sober for even a month, your body will change. Another headline, 8 things we've learned about how alcohol harms the body. And then you look at the New York Times, quote, virtually any drinking increases cancer risk in older adults, study finds. Quote, moderate drinking raises health risks while offering few benefits. Quote, how the risks of drinking increase in older age. Quote, he was getting weaker and more confused. Could it be his drinking? Quote, that's a good one. I mean, we really could do a Saturday Night Live skit here. This is the New York Times.
That one might be true.
Well, quote, deep links between alcohol and cancer are described in new report. So I mean, I could keep going on and on about this, but again, I think it's just important to frame that for some reason, and again, this is a little bit unfortunate that just in the age that we live in, a lot of nuance and analysis and careful, usage of common sense has just been thrown out the window in favor of much more polarizing, much more reactionary headlines. So,
I agree. I think what you both are highlighting is one of the struggles that journalists have in communicating about science. Like, my background has been in science since I was in college and into graduate school, and I was always interested in articles that I in a science field that I knew more about to kind of see how things got transferred into a more common vernacular to write for a more popular audience, and how people are really bad at estimating what statistics mean for them. And so then how you communicate about those statistics is really, really important. And that's kind of what you were highlighting, Amy. And I think, Brandon, those headlines kind of add like a, it's, you know, they're not numbers, but they're narratives that are coming out of a bad interpretation of numbers. And, you know, if you've ever read Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, he does a really good job at showing how poor human beings are at estimating what's best for them statistically. And so
I've got to check that out. I've never heard of that. I don't. Is he a scientist?
He's he's actually, he and his main research partner, who passed away before Danny Kahneman was awarded. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in psychology.
Oh.
Because he
was one of those like smarty pants people.
Yes, he and Alex Tversky kind of upended some of, it's my understanding, I'm not an economist, but they upended some of the fundamental assumptions that economists made about how people, like if you had this sort of utilitarian view that people on average over the long haul will choose what's best for themselves because it's in their own best interest. And basically what they showed is we're not good at that. And so you can't, and part of the reason we're not good at it is that we're not good at like understanding basic, like challenging basic statistical numbers like you highlighted. I mean, like a 30% increase sounds like a lot. So you're thinking, I just had a sip of wine, I just increased my chances. Like you think you now have a 30% chance of getting cancer. That might be what someone thinks based on that headline. And that's completely wrong. It's totally wrong, and so you would expect, although I've learned to stop expecting it, you would expect a journalist who ought not to have an agenda if they're just conveying information to go out of their way, if they understand that the audience is like this, they ought to go out of their way to show nuance more, to show actual facts. And that's where, even though of course we're in the camp of loving wine and enjoying imbibing it and being together with it. And so obviously we're biased, but it's difficult to kind of hear those headlines, even see how those statistics are written about, and not conclude that there is some alternative agenda at play aside from I'm interested in your health.
Well, let me ask you along that line. So how do I estimate my risk? Is there my personal risk? Is there, Tyler, I love it. Is there any way for me to do that? Because I think what you're saying is like a population-wide study doesn't directly translate to an individual. And is that because that there are just too many confounding variables? When you read these breast cancer studies, they say that they've accounted for every variable possible. I don't know how they could do that, but I guess the question I'm asking is like, how do I actually know what my risk is? Is there a way to know?
I personally, I think the answer with these tiny percentages is probably no. I mean, you can get lung cancer and never smoke a day in your life. There's lung cancers that start that have nothing to do with smoking, but we know that it's like if you smoke, be careful. And so we want to be careful. We We don't say, oh, well, the exception, proves the rule. But at the same time, like Amy, I don't want to share our medical connection, but
I don't mind. I was actually going to ask you guys, and I can cut this out, but we all have cancer or have had cancer, every single one of us.
Right.
It's the alcohol.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the alcohol in any of our cases.
Exactly. I mean, I was not much of a drinker.
Do you want me to cut that out, by the way?
No, that's fine.
No, you're all good. Okay.
And so, estimating my risk, I'm trying to so I know I have this history. And in order to not die, right, from my ailment, I had to receive poison, which increases my probability of getting some other cancer sometime in the future way more than drinking this glass of wine I'm having right now. And so even then, though, I can't personally evaluate and estimate what drinking this glass of wine is adding to this risk I already have. Other than I'm pretty sure it's a tiny, tiny, tiny contribution, so tiny that most statisticians would say it's zero. When I get x-rays, which I still do, one of my oncologists, I don't see anymore, but he's like, we should just do a CAT scan. I should just do the PET scan every time, where they, for the audience that doesn't know, they inject you with this radioactive glucose and the cancer eats it faster and it lights up, right? I was like, well, I don't want, any extra radiation. He's like, oh, your treatment gave you so much radiation. Like there's no more amount we can give you that is going to cause any extra problems. I'm like, oh, okay, that's a good way to think about it.
I've had the same
and
comment.
So I think it is that way.
About that. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe this means that they're like all of us we're living with this death wish and we don't mind drinking, but that isn't the point. The point is, to your question, I would love to see some of these articles point out how difficult it is to transfer aggregate epidemiological research into an individual's experience and what they may actually be risking. And that's where headlines like "there's no safe level of drinking" feels really irresponsible. Like that's not good science. I don't think that's good journalism. That's like, so what's the third option there? It seems to be an agenda. Like I don't know what if it's not good science and it's not good journalism, I don't know how you could. It feels politicized, which I think is the body that came up with that is a political body.
Yeah, which it clearly has been. And Felicity Carter, who's an Aussie journalist out of Europe, I mean, she's done phenomenal work in taking a look at the backgrounds of these panels and the individual scientists. And folks can Google that. Felicity Carter, she was writing for Meiningers at the time, which is a German publication. But if you just Google Felicity Carter Neo-Prohibitionist, she sort of wrote the absolute, then this is real journalism. This is actually what the sort of people that we need to do these things. But what she uncovered was that if you go back and look at the people who came to the conclusions that led to that WHO no safe amount agenda, they're actually the same people who went to work on trying to put a similar initiative in Canada together a few years ago, which failed. And multiple members of that same committee, lo and behold, were part of the efforts in the United States. So they've actually since been pushed out of the US connections due to these. But they actually have connections, some of them that actually go back to temperance movements that go all the way back to prohibition. So that's where the word neo-prohibitionist actually comes into play, because they're these sort of social science conglomerates that are coming together, because they have an agenda, be that from their religion or be that from a kind of social justice perspective in terms of trying to rid society of the expense and evils of alcoholism or alcohol-related harm. And so again, perhaps some of that bias actually could be used in a more positive way in terms of, reducing the stigma of addiction and trying to actually help those who really do need help with this. But again, for the vast, vast majority, this just comes across as, pure bias. And again, that's unreported in any of the major media outlets who've done so much work on this, which I personally think is deeply irresponsible for somebody like the New York Times or National Geographic to not, look under the hood enough to see who your sources are. And within that, going back to your question, Amy, of contextualizing the risk, there was, again, I kind of first became aware of this from a really big New York Times Magazine article, which I believe was about 1.5 years ago. That article, again, had a scary headline, and it was, basically trying to, deeply criticize, quote, moderate consumption. And one of the major contributors to that article is this gentleman, Tim Stockwell, who I can't remember if he's a social scientist. I believe he's in the social scientists up at University in Victoria, BC. But he was sort of taken in different contextual ways throughout that article and many, many others to really parrot the risk starts with the first drop line. But when the author actually made him, come clean with what risk he really thought an average person might have, He said, quote, "Those who have 2 drinks a week, that choice amounts to less than 1 week of lost life on average," he said. "Consume 7 alcoholic beverages a week, comma, and that amount goes up to about 2.5 months." So if we look at the lifespan of the average American, I'm going to pull some fun stats here. So if you're looking at U.S., which by the way, that lifespan in the U.S. has come down a little bit recently, but you're looking at about 76 years. And one thing that I think is really fun to do is to actually contextualize this globally and try to, from a common sense standpoint, say, well, okay, if it follows that any amount of consumption is risky, don't you think that those who have the highest alcohol consumptions would then have the shortest lifespans? Mm-hmm. And those who avoided alcohol would have the longest lifespans? So I did a little project last year where I looked at France and Italy, who are the 2 most, particularly for wine, highest consumers of alcohol, but they're actually high alcohol consumers in general. And the lifespan in France and Italy is 82.32 years. So a good notch up above the good old US of A, where of course in the US of A we have a mix of a much lower consumption. And then if you look at the teetotalers, so if you look at Muslim societies where drinking is not only discouraged but deeply prohibited by law, the average Indonesian, 67 years. The average Afghan citizen, almost 62. Now, of course, there's other contextual things there, and we can talk about standards of living. But I just think that that's a useful thing to think about. When you ask, gosh, having a glass of wine tonight with dinner, like, is this? These headlines make it seem like you're going to potentially have the risk of dying next year. So I think again,
they really do.
It's important to keep it in context.
And I know, Tyler, you have thoughts on when do we want to die anyway?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, I like that kind of contextualization, Brandon, and like thinking about these different societies because, and I'll get to that point in a second, Amy. But what I think one of the things I think you highlight is actually similar to the way I talk about making wine to some people who don't know as much about making wine, which is, my first goal, and I tell this to any young aspiring winemaker that works for us, your first goal should be to figure out what are the 5 to 6 things that describe 85 to 90% of the outcome. Because in winemaking, like we know, even if you like assume your fruit source is great, right? That's a huge factor. But then pick timing, how long is it on the skins? Like there's these things that we know that really, if you pay a lot of attention to those, most of the time you're going to be fine. And then there's these things in the margins. So for the remaining 15% that influences the outcome, there might be 100 things or more. And so when you compare these societies like you did, it's clear that there are things way beyond alcohol that influence the bottom line outcome of longevity. And then you're right, Amy, like and this is the kind of stuff it's tough to get into because I think I'm in a minority position on this. Like I said to both of you earlier that, I think even the people on our side of this equation that are trying to bring, I think, more sensible discussion around alcohol to it will still operate with this abiding assumption in the background that the number of days we live is one of the most important things about being a human. And I just would completely disagree with that. I think that the way we live and who we become is way more important than how many days we spend on this earth. And so this whole discussion is kind of almost couched by so many of us agreeing that, oh yeah, the length of days is the most important thing. And I just totally reject that assumption. And I really think that wine in particular, and of course I like other alcoholic beverages, but I think wine's the most transcendent, interesting, intellectually as well as pleasurable fermented beverage you can have. And I'll go to my grave making that argument. And
I will, but I would say like a nice gin martini does not hurt.
Oh, it doesn't hurt. There's a context to that. The thing is, you can put wine anywhere, though. It's like gin martini, yes. There's this, like, you want it.
There's a time and a place, way. Sunset Boulevard.
Like, you're not having, it's hard to have a cocktail with a meal, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I know there's people that do that.
Unless you're at Leonardo's and they're out of every wine on the list, which they seem to be whenever we go. And then it's like, I'll have a second martini. But okay. Anyway.
So yeah, I really believe that there is way more to life, than how many days I live. And I will say, even though I got cancer young, I believed that before I got cancer. That wasn't something that came to me as a result of having to ponder death. I pondered death in high school because I was a high schooler trying to figure out what the heck my life meant. And so you get, well, I wanted to mean something. And my conclusion wasn't, oh, well, what's going to give it meaning is to make sure I live at least the average of the U.S. male lifespans who are left-handed, which, by the way, left-handed people live a little less. Left-handed males, I'm going down.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Peter's left-handed. I guess you knew that.
In fact, we could probably look up the data. My guess is my left-handedness shortens my lifespan more than this glass of wine I'm having right now.
Clearly more than the glass of wine, and probably more than all of the wine that you've ever consumed in your lifetime.
Yeah. And Brandon, the data you mentioned, that guy quoting where it was like 2.5 days or whatever, and then it went up to 6 months. Like, what I would wonder is, okay, what happens when you go to 40 drinks? Is it still 6 months? It's not a linear regression, right? So there's got to be an inflection point, again, where it's like, okay, this clearly is not a primary driver of an outcome of days living, and days living, as I was just articulating, probably shouldn't be our primary driver of what it means to be a flourishing human being.
Amen. I mean, you can.
And why aren't people talking about this?
Well,
because no one wants to talk about death. Yeah, and it's like that. It's so loaded, which is all I want to talk about is death and money. So I'll talk to you guys about that any day.
Not taxes.
I think to answer your question of why are people to answer your question about why are people talking about this, I think that it's absolutely no surprise that the current sort of milieu around anti-alcohol is happening at the same time of the rise of the wellness influencer. And so you look at the popularity of influencers like Andrew Huberman, his podcast, which came out with just this unbelievable anti-alcohol episode a couple of years ago, which again I had several friends. I mean, as soon as they listened to that, they immediately sent it to me and say, "Oh, be careful! You've got to listen to this." And in his 2.5 hours, I mean, there was, again, there are some interesting things looking at it from a neuroscientist perspective, but there was just an utter mountain of bias, within his commentary. And I think that you also find other popular sort of people on the medical side, like Dr. Peter Attia, who he wrote a book called Outlive. So he's in that longevity space, but he's somebody who's, I think, is an interesting one to look at in this, because his take on longevity, to your point, Tyler, he actually talks about the difference between lifespan, which is just the aggregate number of days or minutes lived, and health span. And so really his goal is to actually, rather than try to increase lifespan and then have you sit in a wheelchair for X number of years drooling, he's trying to look at health span, where you can actually be active and healthy and as healthy as you possibly can later in life. But again, there are dozens, if not probably, actually there's probably hundreds, but dozens of quite popular folks with platforms that are well into the millions for their podcasts or for their YouTube channels who are talking about this subject in that way. And even a lot of those experts are somewhat confused. I mean, if you look at Peter Attia, he has kind of waffled back and forth on the alcohol issue, because again, some of these studies, as the studies comes out, I think that he feels obligated to try to take those similar headlines into account. And he's somebody who's a very big fan of the double-blind placebo-controlled study, which is essentially impossible in the category that we're talking about.
Right.
I think we talked about that earlier, about how could we actually try to do this research. And there's been very, very little research done. We're all in the field of wine. Most of this is just alcohol. Right. And and something that's still an open question is, I mean, if you drink two shots of Everclear a day, is that going to lead to a different health outcome than 2 glasses of organically grown wine consumed with meals? And the answer on that is not out there yet.
Well, and Brandon, with your research, because I don't think we've touched on this yet, I might have got alluded to earlier, but no one has, to my knowledge, suggested that some of the original research that I think the NASEM was using to suggest overall the all mortality rate goes down with moderate consumption. And it is these, maybe there's specific cases like we mentioned around cancer, but like if you are going to take an aggregate view, then it seems like the aggregate view is you should drink a little, because on average as a human on the planet, your mortality rate goes down, probably because cardiovascular issues are still number one killers. Mm-hmm. And those issues, I think, are still believed to go down with moderate consumption. And so even when you, do you know, Brandon or Amy, do you know anyone that is, or not anyone, has there been any studies that have suggested that what we thought was true in that regard of all mortality rate going down is not true? Or is it?
So the issue with that, to your point, I mean, that's spot on, and I'll contextualize this in one thing. So there was a New York Times article recently with the headline, quote, "Older adults do not benefit from moderate drinking, large study finds." And I went to the study itself because I wanted to see what the study said. Of course, with a headline like that, again, like Amy back at the beginning of this, it scares you awake a little bit. And in the results of the very study where they somehow came up with that headline, there were these quotes, quote, "Wine preference, more than 80% of alcohol from wine, and drinking with meals showed a small protective associations with mortality, especially from cancer."
Wow.
So there's
wow, that's crazy. Of course, nobody goes back to read the study except you. You're the only person in the United States that did that, Brandon.
That's in the results. That's in the first paragraph.
Yeah.
I mean, this
that's
is the thing that's so crazy
Brandon.
about it. They also said, quote, "No associations for higher mortality were found for low or moderate risk drinking patterns versus occasional drinking among individuals without socioeconomic or health-related risk factors." Mm-hmm. So to your point, Tyler, in terms of the levers that actually influence risk, you know, things like economic status, you know, so somebody living in poverty, they're going to have the deck stacked against them from a health perspective, regardless of drinking. And so there have, and then zooming back out a little bit to your question about the cardiovascular benefit, there's still hundreds, if not thousands, of studies which have shown an actual cardiovascular health benefit from moderate wine consumption, particularly of red wine. And I think that's something that, again, we need to think about common sense. And I mean, so when you have a series of study after study after study that's actually identifying, even if it's a teeny tiny potential benefit, even if it's actually a net zero benefit, let's look at the number one killer. So if cardiovascular is the number one killer, those diseases, if wine might barely protect from them, well, frankly, that's a good thing. That's the number one cause of death. So again, it just, to me, it just shows this utter disregard for common sense that I just find so incredibly frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a question about those studies. Are these all is this all self-reporting? Alcohol consumption is self-reported?
I think you'd have to look at the study. I mean, in most cases, it's going to be, because again, there's not going to be these these are the cohorts. If you're studying a cohort over any period of time, they're not going to be within a lab for that.
I have never, ever, not one time been honest with my doctor about how much I drink. Never. How much do you drink? And I'm like, how many am I allowed? 7 a week. Yeah, that's how many I'm allowed. That's what I'm doing. So, I mean, I have a couple questions for you guys. One is has this changed your business in any way, and the way you either promote yourself or what you talk about in the tasting room? And two, has it changed your consumption? And I just want to start by saying that all of this really changed my consumption. This was even before I got diagnosed with breast cancer. Tyler and I had a similar cancer, which was Hodgkin's disease, when we were younger, and both received radiation, chest radiation, which is what I had. It causes breast cancer later on. So to your point, Tyler, the poison is the cure. But when my doctor mentioned something about breast cancer and it increasing, I immediately went from, this was like 5 years ago. Maybe this was even before some of the breast cancer studies came out. But she was an addiction specialist, which I did not know, at Kaiser. And she told me, you cannot drink every day. You cannot drink wine every day, even if it's just 2 glasses. You have to cut back. Try to cut it way back. So I cut it back to 6 days a week. And then the next year to 5 to 4. This year I'm only drinking wine 3 days a week. And before we had this conversation last week, I realized that I go through this thing every day I'll go, God, do I get to have wine tonight or not? And then I'll sort of be like, not tonight. I can't tonight. And I put these barriers up. And then I say to Peter, we can only have wine. This is my thing to share. And he's always like, stop putting rules on me. We can only have wine like when we go out, or if I know we're having like a VGS and I have another industry party or there's something. And then I realize we're like halfway into the year and Peter and I have barely split a bottle of wine at home together, because I usually drink at events. And I just this week was like, fuck this. I was like, I only drink 3 days a week. This way I'm going to drink 4. I might start drinking 5. I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm so tired of like living in fear and all that. Like, I think what I wrote down is that thing that you said about the first drop, both of you, whoever that, and that was quoted in the New York Times article, that is a fear mongering statement, specifically to say you cannot have a single drop of alcohol. And when I look at like, I exercise, I keep my weight in order, all these things, we're not sedentary. Like, these are the things that are really important to prevent like cardiovascular disease. So it changed my alcohol consumption, and now I'm mad at everybody. So I think I'm going back to the way I was before. So back to you. Has it changed your consumption? And I do want to say one more thing about you. Brandon, I don't know if you know this, Tyler. Brandon has not been hungover since like 2007. Did you know this? Or maybe it's even more than that.
No,
2006.
I knew. He's the best one.
And Brandon, you can talk about that, but you are the most moderate drinker that I know. So business and personal.
Well, I'll pick up the baton on personal since you mentioned that, but I think that I just wish that we could trumpet this from the rooftops, because my own experience with this is something that I believe is commonsensical, which is that I believe that Mother Nature has equipped us with a device in order to modulate risk of alcohol consumption, and that's called a hangover. And so if you have a hangover, you probably went too far. And so that was just, my own, after a particularly nasty hangover in 2006, I just decided I don't want to feel that way ever again. And just self-modulated my consumption, back from that.
Yeah, but you were in Australia drinking with Australians, which is fucking crazy. Like, I mean, of course you would be hungover. I can't imagine that you'd ever probably consume that much in your life in one night.
No, not typically.
Yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
I was just, I'm like Brandon. I mean, I can't say I haven't been hungover since 2007, but I have personal feelings, religious feelings about keeping my wits about me. I just don't want to have alcohol be the governor of my behavior. I want to be able to be responsible. So I would say that I have a frequency of drinking that's high, but I certainly have moderation personally, because I think that's just important relationship with alcohol. I'm not drinking it to have any intoxicating effects. Sometimes that might happen because it's so hard when there's so many good wines at like a VGS, and you get talking and you forget to spit, and it can get hard. But it's because the wines are so good, and they give so much pleasure, and they taste great, and it's fun with friends, and But even in those scenarios, I'm usually able to keep my wits about me and stay at a level that is very enjoyable and doesn't lead to any biological hangover effect or feedback mechanism. And I would say that kind of ethos, like for our business, getting to that question, is kind of how our business is. I mean, we're making luxury tiered wines. We're talking for our red wines. I think our least expensive wine is $55 or $65. And these aren't wines that you buy to like get hammered on. These are wines that if you open a bottle, and I have had the good fortune of most of my career making wines like that, and so I have them at home. I have those wines, and I can open a bottle and have one glass with dinner for 4 nights in a row, 5 nights in a row. It depends if Byron is having some too, and that wine will be good on the 4th day, because that's the quality of wine we're making. And so I don't know that our customer type is such that we've seen, I mean, certainly there's less, you guys know, traffic in our area. We know in aggregate, there's plenty of studies showing that people are drinking less. And so it's hard to say it's not affecting our business, but I wouldn't say it's affected our messaging. I'm not sure. We're not trying to promote ourselves as, there was some wine, a fit wine or something like that. There's some brand out there that,
It
does
just
like
makes me nuts.
drink
Yeah.
wine, not sugar. And like that's just not what wine's for. Like wine's not a fitness beverage. That's not what neither is Michelob Ultra, by the way, for those of you listening or watching. I don't know, those advertisements make it look like it's a fitness beverage, but is that Gatorade or is that beer? And that's just not the intent of wine, and so it doesn't, for us, it hasn't affected our marketing, and we're troubled by the messaging and how it might affect the alcohol industry writ large, but yeah.
Yeah, Brandon,
Yeah,
business-wise?
I'd follow with that. I don't see a direct correlation. However, I do think one of the, I don't know if ironic or just upsetting actually might be a better word for it. One of the problems with a lot of the communication that's come out in regards to public health entities and then media organizations is that frankly the people who likely have the highest levels of consumption, which could be helped by moderating influences, are probably some of the least likely people to be reading the New York Times. And so no, I have a real frustration about this. That's a little bit of the opening scene of Idiocracy, where there's this element where a lot of the people who probably have some of the healthiest habits are going to probably be the people to pull back the most. And Amy, I think you'd fall right into that category. You're super well read, you're intelligent, you're paying attention to these things, and you want to do the right thing for your body, which is all the more reason why I think that it's irresponsible the way that so much of the media is communicated about this.
Yeah, this healthy wine thing makes me insane because Tyler, you and I've had so many conversations about this. I'll call out. I won't say what the brand name is, but this gets into my natural wine rant, which we are not moving into that realm. Don't worry. But about no unwanted additives, healthy for you, no sugar. No sugar equals no hangover. I mean, it makes me insane. And I'm in the tasting room a lot, so what I hear is from people being like, "Oh, this wine is a little sweet," and I get a little defensive about that, about this idea of like sugar. Like if a wine doesn't have sugar, that means it's healthy or whatever. But none of us make wines with any residual sugar, like zero. And I mean, 95% of wines in the world, that are supposed to be dry, we're putting Apothic and maybe some New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, like that have tiny amounts of RS in there. Like to relate that, when really, like if we're really looking at it, like alcohol is. If there's any unhealthy portion of that drink, it probably is the alcohol in it, right? And not the sugar, but no one talks about that. No one talks about that at all. And the additive part of it, it all just makes me crazy. But I do want to play devil's advocate for just a second. And Brandon, you had mentioned something like 110 members of Congress want this study reviewed. Is this the study from the ICCUD
Yes. Yeah.
Organization?
So
okay.
Yeah, with that, what they're trying to do, which I actually very much agree with this and have sent notes to my members of Congress as well. Is
Love
to let
a guy
the
who sends a note to Congress. Yeah.
Well, let the scientists make the scientific decision. So, that NASM panel has several Harvard medical doctors. Actually, 4 Harvard medical doctors, the Dean of Health at Colorado School of Public Health, and the Professor of Epidemiology and Director of Nutrition at the University of Iowa Public Health. So I'm going to take their science over the social scientists any day in this regards to this.
That's the team I want.
Yeah, but are these 110 members of Congress being lobbied by big alcohol? So I've started seeing this. What it used to be you would see big tobacco everywhere. The last thing in something I read in the New York Times was like big alcohol. I had never heard that term before, but surely Southern Wine and Spirits, I'm throwing that out there, I have no idea, is lobbying their members of Congress in order to kind of get these studies changed. And I guess I just want to know, what's the opposite side of that? If people are lobbying and biased one way, what about the bias on the other side? And how do we know Congress isn't being lobbied or paid off as would be?
Congress is clearly being lobbied, and there's traditional lobbying where there's just money thrown to create influence, and then there's actually sort of another way to look at it, which is one of the things that's happened is once the tobacco battle was won, all those law firms and public advocacy groups, the NGOs who were supporting that, they didn't just pick up stakes and disappear. So they're still around and looking for new issues. So in fact, a number of the best kind of class advocacy firms who had litigated the tobacco cases against big tobacco are now turning their attention to alcohol. And I mean, I think that's something that should frighten, not only, producers or whatnot, but even the everyday citizen. Because again, when you're coming in with this laser-like bias, that's one of the reasons why you're actually starting to hear the word big alcohol. And again, we're all incredibly microscopic at our production size, and I think that we would have our own things to say about the way that big influencers have made really incredibly poor decisions and influenced really poor laws regarding interstate shipping, for instance, or wine distribution.
Oh my God, totally, yeah.
It's ridiculous. So I think that actually should be brought into the daylight quite a bit more too. I mean, that really, if that's part of the thing that's influencing some of the studies as well. And to your point, to play devil's advocate, there have been studies in the past that have been removed. One of the studies that was going to be involved in that NASEM in their findings for the USDA guidelines, at least one of their studies was removed from the cohort because it had actually had some funding from, I don't know who, I can't remember exactly who, but somebody within the alcohol universe. But the problem, this brings up another problem in terms of trying to assess science, is that this science needs to be funded by somebody. And so you have to question that inherent bias. I mean, again, if the neo-prohibitionists are funding a study, the objective of that study is probably going to aim to find dangers or hazards within alcohol. And if Southern Wine and Spirits, for instance, was doing a study, I'm sure that they would hope that the results showed a benefit. And really what would be better for society at large is if there were actually just unbiased government studies that could look at larger cohorts. And some of those studies are starting to be done. There's actually a really large study underway in Spain that's starting to look at the difference between wine consumption and other alcohol consumption. So, perhaps in time we'll get, a better representation or some more accurate information. But right now, there's a lot of different levers trying to tip the scales.
Yeah.
I think too, we have to be careful, and I'm going to wade into some tricky ground here, but I think we have to be careful on both sides of any issue to equate bias or lobbying with discredibility. That just because there is a lobbyist and just because that lobbyist is funded by a pro whatever the issue is, does not mean the results of a study are not right. There's still, I believe truth does exist. It's not simply...
What?
No, I know.
Talking about...
I know. It's not just my personal feeling or my personal bent that...
Or your truth?
Or my truth that matters. And so it could be true that there's someone who's thrown a lot of money at lobbying a bunch of senators and they did it for bad reasons, and yet the senators' actions could still actually be right because with the issue in hand and the information available, they're right. And I think that's an important point in this conversation around alcohol, is that it should be based on a correct understanding of an imperfect, in the sense that we can't get a black and white answer. Mm-hmm. You choose the wisest, most discerning course you can based on the information you have. And the money on both sides that are trying to advocate and lobby, you would hope that the truth of the matter would be ultimately what stands. And I'm not ignorant that interpretation of that truth will be influenced by money that someone's getting. But at the same time, that because that happens does not mean then that the person who's lobbying is wrong about what they're lobbying for.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That is a really I think unique point of view and a true point of view. We are almost at an hour. Do you guys have anything else to say? Tyler, you always have a little rant on pleasure that I love to hear.
Well, I had to ask my wife if I could share this, but I think I mentioned to you guys before we had this call that I alluded to this before. I just think there's so many more things than the number of days you live that are important to how you live and the quality of your life. And my wife and I have a tradition. We try to get away on our anniversary. We open up a bottle of champagne and we make love, and that is just an amazing liturgy of our marriage.
I love it.
25 years in. And does that mean you
Wait,
have
what
to...
day's your anniversary so I can... No, I'm totally kidding.
And I should say, by the way, I should get this. See, this is why I shouldn't have brought this up.
I love this stuff.
I love it.
We have a wonderfully relational intimacy that leads
Yes.
to wonderful intimacy in other ways all year round, and we don't need the champagne to get us to that point. But there's just something amazing about an excellent bottle of champagne. The sound of the cork, the bubbles, the freshness, and you're celebrating. We toasted our marriage the day it was. My dad was passionate about, because we actually didn't have alcohol at our reception for cost reasons. But my dad refused to give a toast. My dad was my best man, and he refused to give a toast without champagne. And so he funded the champagne, and we had champagne on our wedding day, So anyway, I just think that's good living, that's good life, and we're losing sight of that by trying to. I don't know if it's because people are trying to control their own destiny and living so much that they need these sort of black and white answers and are uncomfortable living in this sort of gray world that we live in, where you can't make perfect choices, but it doesn't mean you can't live really well. All of the social injustices out there and systematic problems that exist acknowledged, right? But I think I've nearly finished this really, really nice Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's been a lovely conversation, and I'm glad I was sipping wine while we were having it.
Yeah, I wish I was. Tonight will be my 4th night drinking this week, and I'm doing it. But don't worry, I'm taking off tomorrow because then I'm going to drink Sunday and Monday with friends in LA, and I'm so looking forward to that. Brandon, Sparks-Gillis, what do you got for me?
I mean, it's really hard to follow Tyler there. I mean, that was a beautiful,
we don't have
beautiful way to tie everything together. So mine won't be quite as sexy, but I mean, I always like to highlight the cultural benefit of wine. And when you look at the fact that this is something that's been with humans for about 8,000 years, maybe longer, it's something that over those millennia have, fostered incredible senses of community. And, we can talk about this firsthand from our own times, breaking bread and eating dinner and drinking great wines. But it's something that builds community, connection, and culture. And in this day and age of increased polarization, there could really be nothing better than sharing a glass of wine. And I just think that the more, and again, sure, do it in a moderate way, but I think that the more that we can come together, and again, this is, you could tie together politics, you could tie together so many different things where, really, if we could actually just converse with each other and, let the wine flow to enable those conversations, it's going to be a net benefit. And I'll tie this all the way back to where we started, which is that the former Surgeon General who, started to raise alarm bells about alcohol, that same Surgeon General, a year prior to that proclamation, issued this big treatise on, quote, our epidemic of loneliness and isolation.
Yeah.
And then for some reason in his, I believe it was, 40 or 50 page report about alcohol, he didn't mention a single thing about how alcohol can engender community and foster relationships. So I just think, again, it's important to think about things more holistically. And, again, don't drink too much. But moderate consumption can be something that can be an incredible way to enhance our lives. And, whether we live 20 years, 50 years, or 100 years, that's going to be a good thing. So I think we should do it more often.
Yeah, I love that. I love you guys. And I really appreciate you being here. You're really like 2 of my favorite people in the world. And we'll talk one-on-one about all sorts of other stuff. We talked about, I don't know, we got into death today, but let's definitely talk about money next time we're together.
Well, I would love
yeah.
to pursue Brandon's comment there. I think he's right. I'd actually made a point I wrote down a note about the cultural significance of wine.
Yeah.
You could maybe make an argument that's as important as art to the human existence over the last 8,000 years. And so can you imagine a world without art?
No, this is crazy. Like the MW is a credential in the art and science of wine. I sometimes joke, I do fire sales on wine in the tasting room. I call it Peter's hoarded stash that Amy's tired of looking at. And it's just that Peter builds up, wine in the winery. And I'm like, God, we got to get rid of this. We got to sell it, because I see cash on a wall and Peter sees art on a wall. And it's like it's really a different way of looking at that. But I do very much consider what all of we do. We're creating art. I don't think that a $6 bottle of Burgundy at CVS is art, but I think what we do is that. So no, I can't imagine a world without art. I would hate that. All right, that's it, guys.